The first time someone was sitting and looking at it and she started crying. Philosophers have mostly spoken about death, but it's also about existence. What does it mean to decolonize death? Death is more powerful than the sun. And it's a very deep truth. As a map of death and dying, you can use it to talk about it and explore that area. And Jerry, who was the director of prevention and well-being, she said that, Chetan, can you wayfind death?
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today, I'm speaking with Chetan Shastri, a Melbourne-based designer and researcher whose groundbreaking work explores how design can support conversations about death and dying. Chetan is the creator of the Bioscope, an award-winning co-design tool developed with palliative care practitioners to help facilitate meaningful, human-centred dialogue around end-of-life care. His work has been recognised by the Victorian Premier's Design Awards and showcased at the Design Outlook Conference. With a practice rooted in empathy, creativity, and systems thinking, Chetan is reshaping how we talk about death, not as a taboo, but as a necessary, even transformative part of life. Thank you so much for being with us today, Chetan.
Thank you, Catherine, for having me on your podcast. I'm very excited to be here.
Now, can you talk through those of us who may not be familiar with what a bioscope is? What is it?
Okay, so I can talk about this in many ways. So if I go off track, just pull me back in. So when in India, Bioscope has strong associations with cinema because we used to have like this guy used to be called the Bioscope Wala, means the person who owns the bioscope or its custodian. And it was like usually be a big box with lots of kind of scopes that you could look into. So he would bring it and set it up, and all the children would run to the bioscope wala, and they'd probably pay him money, and then they'd each get a scope like that to look into it.
So, like a kaleidoscope you'd look into. Is that kind of
Yes,
a box with multiple kaleidoscopes?
yes. And inside it, he would have like a film, and he would roll it like that,
Oh,
and then there
wow.
would maybe sometimes there would be a like a gramophone and there would be sound and you'd see those images moving,
Oh,
and
wow.
that's kind of the first impression of the bioscope and how before there were cinema halls and even after cinema halls and theater like film theaters, you would still have the bioscope wala who used to come for a long time.
And so just explaining that, so there was a box and there was a series of holes that you could look through, and
Yes.
what he would do is he would actually turn the image at the top of the
Yes.
box, so you would be looking through the holes and you'd see the image in a circular motion turning around, like a
Absolutely.
horse, racing or
Yes.
something along that on obviously a round dome. And so you'd see the image moving because he was turning it at the top of a box using a handle. And then there
True.
would be music via a gramophone that you would
Yes.
also hear as well.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Oh, that's fantastic. I was just wanting to explain that because you were doing hand motions, and sometimes hand motions don't translate well into the
Absolutely.
podcast.
Yes. Okay. Okay,
So
yes.
thank you.
So that I associate the bioscope with, but in Latin, obviously, bio is life, and the scope is something through which you look. So it is like looking at life through this thing which I have made, and it's actually in terms of what I have made, it's a physical artifact, just like the one on the back, but this was an initial sort of a maquette. This is 1/4 of the actual bioscope. So, like the bioscope has 4 parts, so this in its entirety would be one part, and then each of it has sides. So, like the bioscope, all in its entirety, is a map or a cartography. It is a map of death actually. So it's a map of something that is intangible. So it's a terrain of death, and then but it takes metaphors from like actual cartography. So it has sites on it, like in a city, you might imagine buildings as sites, or in a desert, there might be dunes. So it has those concentric circles, which you can think of as sites. And then, like, each site has its proximity mapping. So all the concepts and ideas around uh, concepts around one idea may be clustered together, and then in its entirety, it's this terrain which has many sites. And as a map of death and dying, you can use it to talk about it and explore that area.
I've had the beautiful opportunity to feel and touch the bioscope because you've done a beautiful job of, when most people think of a map, they think of it as in a paper form, and it has, as you were saying, symbols for, lakes, symbols for railways, symbols for roads. But what you have created is a beautiful artwork because it is in textiles. So you've used fabric, and then you have, as you said, the four different sections that form part of the entire bioscope as itself. And each of them are beautifully designed images or little icons that represent something different. So just looking behind you, and we'll have images of the bioscope in the show notes so people can have a look at what we're talking about. But it is really beautiful. So just even talking me through, perhaps, is that a little horse that I'm seeing behind your head?
Yeah, it's interesting because this one, like, I did the stitching and the zippers and like everything, but the applique on the top and the embroidery on the right is hand done, and it's done by my mom. And she has a background, like she was an artist, but then she taught fashion and textile design in a design school in India for 20 or so years. And then, like, recently she was also the director of a textile museum in Cambodia. And growing up, Catherine, like, because I would go to the university with her after classes or whatever, and then I decided that I didn't want to be a fashion designer because that's how we were as like boys in 2000, early 2000, and to do I wanted to be a sculptor actually, and I got into design, and my kind of design was exhibition and space and structures and that sort of a thing. So although my mom was always working with textiles, I was always kind of never involved in it. But when I got an opportunity to go to the Victorian Albert Museum and the Royal College of Art to do my MA in History of Design, like they have Indian collections in the Victorian Albert Museum. They have objects, more than 60,000 objects. And out of that, like 17,000 to 19,000 are just textiles. And what was interesting, Catherine, is that I was working in as a wayfinding designer. So I designed like wayfinding and graphics and maps and signages and type and pictograms for the Bangalore Metro Mass Transit System, which was the second in India. So it has like 85 stations. Each station has three levels, 300 signs, and thousands of people pass through that space. So I was working,
Wow.
yeah.
I can appreciate that because when I was at the Royal Botanic Gardens, I did wayfinding and interpretation. So I could only just imagine how much signage and wayfinding you must have done on that project.
Yes, and it was fascinating because I worked with a British company, a London-based company called Transport Design Consultancy. And when I went to the RC, I was able to work with them again simultaneously alongside my. And when you go into that wayfinding space, it's so it's such a rational and scientific version of design. So I was doing maps for like Network Rail London and Tel Aviv and things like that. But at the same time, I was in the Victoria and Albert Museum looking at textiles, and they had an exhibition called Fabric of India. And in that Fabric of India exhibition, Catherine, there were these map shawls of Kashmir. and you can go online to the V&A collections and write Kashmir map shawl, and you will get those beautiful map shawls. And they are hand embroidered maps of Kashmir. And it's so interesting that my mom is in Kashmir at the moment teaching again. And
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, it's strange that like there is that coincidence, but I've never been to Kashmir. But those maps really kind of, like then when I started thinking that there's this template for wayfinding that, we work with and it's applied everywhere in Riyadh, Tel Aviv in Indonesia, in India, and it came out from that London Underground kind of work, which rounded it with the symbol and the maps. But then when you look at these Kashmir maps, it just opens up your imagination to what like mapping in different cultures can be like. And I think when I came to Melbourne and I went to the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre Hospital, and Jerry, who was the director of prevention and well-being, she said that Chetan, can you wayfind death? Like I didn't do this at Peter Mac. We did an app, but at Alfred this happened. So like, of course, there are signages and there are guides, and then we can use cartographies to wayfind that. So this has that the cartography and the embroidery and the fabric. So it's a very strange way that you know it's not quantifiable in terms of what those influences are exactly. But that's how it came together. And Kashmir map is hand embroidered, and these are hand embroidered on the back, but the bioscope is done on a Japanese machine. So it's a very different sort of making, and it doesn't have iconography so much because that text is what is important. And like now, maybe I feel more confident about iconography and visualizing depth through images, but at that time, I think it was a strategic and a very risk averse choice to use text only.
That's really interesting. So let me just take us back a moment. So you're working with the V&A, in London. You're working on, railways and the underground and mapping that. How did you end up in Australia working in with palliative care?
I think that is also uh, because I think I was not sure of what I want to do, Catherine. So I was like doing things, and when I did exhibition design, I decided that I wanted to do museums, and I thought that is meaningful work for me. Then after London, I started teaching in India, and like I've done two masters, and then like the PhD, and I have been teaching. So I've had like this strong kind of relationship with academic settings as a student, as a teacher, as a researcher. And I wanted to do a PhD because I wanted to be in the university settings, and it seemed like the next logical step. And at that time, I wanted to do my PhD on the history of South Asian material culture. And I went and had a first conversation with my then potential PhD supervisor in Barcelona from London in 2017. And we were talking about either building a project in a prison around food or in palliative care, but through conversations, like the health and design is like an emerging space. And through those conversations, we said that, okay, the palliative care project makes sense. And that time, my supervisor also had a project at Austin Hospital, but by the time got funding and I came to Australia, his project was done. So we were able to reframe it in certain ways because I didn't have a healthcare background. So we said that then what does it mean to decolonize death? So then basically unpacking and deconstructing it and seeing what it means, how we can unpack death is how we started with it. And that because of my work at the VNA and South Asian material culture, that was a easier switch for me to make to see that how can you decolonize that idea culturally or unpack it culturally is how I kind of begin to grapple with this.
And so tell me, the term decolonizing death, for someone who's totally unfamiliar with what that means, can you talk us through it, please?
Yeah, yes, of course. I think again, there are many ways to talk about it. I no longer talk about it as decolonizing death. We kind of talk about it as declinicalizing death or kind of reclaiming death from the hospital. But they are kind of one and the same in terms of, more traditional and cultural ways of thinking about death and dying. And in terms of like now death being colonized by the hospital and mediated by the clinicians mostly. So in that way, like losing the ability or the confidence or the socio-cultural know-how of dealing with death or by talking or being able to talk about it is, and like Paul Fairfield and his book about death, I think there Paul Fairfield very nicely talks, and I can quote him, but I don't have the quote right here. But he says that, like, in the hospital, the death is mediated by the clinicians, but they're not interpreters of the human condition, really, right? So the priests of the past have been replaced by lawyers and administrators and these clinicians, and they're very technical in that sort of a way. So, I mean, that debate and that conversation and that understanding of what the medicalization of death means is quite strong and profound in Australia already. And yeah,
Yes, I have many people who I've interviewed, and we talk about that at one stage in Australia, there was a room dedicated in even architecture and design. You had the parlour at the front of the house, and that would be where you would have your loved one laid out when they had died, so people could come and actually pay their respects and honour that person. And then at the sort of turn of the century, we actually saw that shift where people no longer were using the parlor, and then it became a more of a medicalized process. So it's certainly something that will be familiar to the listeners of the podcast. So you find yourself in Australia and you're working with the one at the Austin had finished, that was right, the project by the time you'd arrived. And then
yes.
how did you introduce this concept, and tell me how it developed over time?
So I can build from we at so in Britain and Australia there was the parlor, but what happens, in India, for example, or in Cambodia, and like as soon as I came here to Australia, it was September, and then of course the university kind of winds down November, December, January, February, and we come back March, so I was able to go home to India. I connected with a NGO, like a non-government organization called Can Support, and they let me go on rounds with a nurse and with a counselor to patients. So in India, we have like public health and private health and the social sector. And the social sector does a lot of the work also because they are funded well. So it is otherwise it's largely private healthcare because the public healthcare infrastructure didn't really grow very much after the British left or did not grow as well as it should have. And then with this NGO, I was able to go and visit patients. So they would visit like 7 patients in a day. So they said I can go for 2 days. So I went for around 1.5 days. And like those were my first experiences of meeting people who were recovering or were in palliative care. And they were all living at their homes with their families. And these guys would meet at the office in the morning, the nurse, the driver, and the counselor, and they would take some morphine in a bag, and then we'd go to each of the houses, and they had all spend half an hour, 1 hour, and then drive to the next place. So like that, it was about 7 patients. I also went to 10 patients because 1.5 days. And then I also went to a hospice called Shanti Avedna Hospice. So it's run by Christian missionaries and it's free and they have quite a few beds, like 20, maybe even 40. And they have like a nursing station in the center and beds all around, but only 2 or 3 beds are occupied because in India people would normally like to take care of like their family at home, and there is stigma and taboo kind of. Other people would say, "Oh, you've left your mom to die in that hospice," even though there's better care and support that they would get there. And over time, like friends of mine have recommended that place and they've taken their parents there. So even people don't even know that it is there. And then after that, I went to Varanasi, Banaras, which is the city of death in India. So that's more of a cultural space. But of course, everything, the burning and happens on the 2 or 3 ghats that are there. The two prominent ghats are there, which are burning bodies around the clock, 24 hours, always a couple of fires burning there. And they burn with wood. There are electric crematoriums also there, but people prefer to use wood and they use like 200 to 500 kilos of wood per body. And like there's a very
Wow,
interesting
that's a lot, isn't it?
that's a lot. And like if people don't have money, they just like villages further up the Ganges, they just put the body. So sometimes you see a body floating around. The E. coli content in the Ganga is like way above any recommended, like 400 times or something like that. And there is a place, a philanthropic sort of a setting called Shanti Avedna Ashram, where people can go for the last 20 days of 15 days of when they're about to die and stay there. Because in Hinduism, we believe that if you die in Kashi or Varanasi or Banaras, you're liberated from the cycle of birth and death, so you will be free of suffering after this kind so everybody wants to die in Kashi. So they are death hotels. So people, when they're 60, 65, 70, they come and stay in some little room in Kashi waiting to die so that they can die there. And in this place, people will travel from far away to come and like spend their last days when they know they are dying. And they don't charge anything but a little bit for electricity, like less than half a dollar, and they let you stay there, let your family stay there. So I took my GoPro and I was able to kind of shoot these things. I thought I'll make a film. And then after kind of, so I was just going and looking at that and what that might mean and what happens because I don't have a healthcare background. And then I went, my mom was in Cambodia, like I mentioned, at that museum as director. So it was like an Indian government posting. And so we would go and stay there. That was my third visit to Cambodia. And we would drive, and then we were able to, like, she had also shot before some funeral ceremonies because in Cambodia, what people do in villages if they are poor. Like if someone dies, they bury the body, wrap it up and bury it. And then when there are 7, 8 people and they have enough money, then they will organize a big funeral and they will pull out those bodies. So she captured one of those mass funerals. But if you're driving in Cambodia, you can see a white flag. It's called a tunga, crocodile flag flying. And wherever the crocodile flag is flying means someone has passed away, and it's the Buddhist monasteries that are there. And so I was able to shoot on video the funerals of like 2 monks. So they're next only to the royal family. So the entire community organizes those ceremonies, and they are fascinating. And like, there is a lot in that conversation in Cambodia, and I have like quite a few hours, like maybe 4 hours of footage, so to edit it into a film. And they have practices like uh, and you know that, of course, that there was the Khmer roots, so they have the killing fields and things like that. So there's a lot of death tourism there. So there are Chinese funerals, there are Buddhist funerals, there are the funerals of the monks, there are the funerals of the poor people, and they don't have healthcare. They have healthcare designed only for the expatriates. So often when someone is dying, that journey is also mediated by the monastery, and that is not necessarily great or healthy, but it is in contrast to healthcare. So when I came back to Melbourne, I wanted to make a film, and then they said, "But ethics." So we said, okay, so said, let's try retrospective ethics. So with PR, started building it. But after a point, I realized that maybe it doesn't make sense to do retrospective ethics. So then I started looking at what makes sense to do in Australia, and then it became very obvious because there's a healthcare or emphasis on healthcare, and there's the hospital. So said, what can we do about death in a hospital? And like I got introduced to people in Peter Mac and at Alfred, and that kind of opened up. But then the pandemic also happened just, when I came back. So that September, October, February, we were in Cambodia and there was all the bushfires. And then, yeah,
Yeah.
so we came back early. And then, but it was okay to be able to build that project through the pandemic. It shifted like the engagement to online modes, but I sort of also learned and benefited from that because, yeah, you plan it for a physical setting and then you decide that doesn't work. So you do it online. And then when things opened up, I was able to go in person. So, yeah, that sort of happened.
And so tell me, when you were going through this planning process, what was it you saw, obviously from your own heritage in India, what you'd seen in Cambodia, what you'd seen to your visits to Varanasi? When you were sitting there thinking about, okay, this is the in an Australian context, what were you planning, or what gaps had you seen where things were done overseas, where you had identified perhaps gaps in the healthcare in Australia, that you thought that the bioscope might be a good tool in which to have these conversations?
There were like not really gaps, but it was like a matter of framing. Like there was like because of all that culture and stuff, I would look at a lot of after death practices, and like that space is like now we're doing a studio at Monash designed for like death and dying and grief. All the students are also kind of gravitate towards that because like that access to the hospital is not there. Like it's GMCT is more accommodating and they'll, do a tour and let them see everything and speak to doulas or go to a funeral home. But talking to a clinician is difficult and problematic and there are barriers to access. So that space of like how do other cultures do burials and those things become more fascinating, but then it became like a broader framing to say like, so what are we doing? So we maybe I'm not doing after death and then one is doing and then death maybe for a long time you're like, no, death does not exist. So then it is not death. So then we are doing dying and we are doing palliative care. And even within that, it is not another person dying. We're looking at the experience of a person who is dying. And then, of course, it has other sort of side effects or, it lends itself to other things and it has transferable qualities. But then the idea and the framing was to look at how to support the experience of a person at end of life. And that's kind of where it began. So, and then it was about navigating death and dying. And when Jerry said that at Peter Mac, she said, "Look, we want to do something so that a patient," and Jerry is not at Peter Mac again, but like I said, she was the director of prevention and well-being and nursing background, and very encouraging, and worked closely with the doctors, and a lot of innovative work she was doing in that space. And probably continues to do that, where she's an adjunct or associate professor now. So Jerry said that let's do wayfinding death, and I think she was digital in her, and that's kind of what is happening in hospitals, because there is technology and they are technical, and they see that technology can do things, and those are the narratives that come from design thinking and innovation and startups and funding, and those cultures are built around building some sort of a digital innovation. So
And something you can do at scale. Whereas something that, I love about the bioscope is the fact that it is something that you can sit round a table, you can touch, you can, move the pieces around to talk about it. And it is such a physical, tactile experience. And that's, I think, part of the beauty of what you've created.
yeah, maybe I digressed from that answer. So working in the hospital, but yes, the Death Cafe, and at Peter Mac, I was able to attend the Death Cafe by Julie Hassard, and she facilitated it. That was my first Death Cafe, and there were clinicians and patients and volunteers, and I think that, and my own thing of finding, like if I'm looking at after death practices, I'm mapping them and putting them down. I'm looking at literature. So this became like a collection of lots of ideas. And suddenly, though, that collection of ideas, you could put it out in a death cafe and talk about those things. And like even in design, there are kind of these ideas, right? Like if you do co-design, you need a toolkit or a visualization and service design to engage participants, or in rural resource mapping, you make a drawing, or someone makes a cultural probe to insert into another context to read it. So these sort of, and of course wayfinding, so map. So that's sort of how that bioscope framing came, and yeah.
And tell me, when I look at the bioscope, you've seemed to have collected, I'm just reading from a couple of the panels now. So one panel, it's set with a series of words in a series of circles. So the first one on the outer circle is hospital, then the next one is hospice, and then residential aged care, home, and then place.
Yes. So the one in the middle, so normally we read from inside out, because the one inside the circle is the name of the site.
You can tell I haven't read your instructions,
No,
Chetan.
no
Sorry.
instructions. No, no instructions. Maybe I should make that
Well, there you go. That's interesting
bolder.
that it
Yeah,
doesn't have instructions as well.
yeah. Maybe I should make, but the title of that site would be Place and Death. But we didn't want to use death on the bioscope in the beginning, because that is taboo, right? So
Yeah.
so it would go to all these gray areas, and then when you go and talk to the doctors, they say, "Of course you can use it. You have to use it." So then it becomes normalized. But there are many gatekeepers and custodians, and it's shared understanding. In some places, some things are okay, like in the church, we cannot talk about voluntary assisted dying. So maybe in the hospital we can. So that happens a lot. But this specific site was one that we tested with the doctors, and we built it with them. So the first workshop had two sites. There was this and the site called, which I had first called alternative therapy, but we changed it to complementary therapies. But this specific site had like 12 or 16 things. So This was place and death. So where should we die? Where can we die? Where would we like to die? And when you put a site in front of the doctors, you'd ask them, so what does this mean? And like, how should it be? So they would unpack it and I'd have things like die on a beach. And then they would say that that sounds like a really nice way to go, but in all probability, it's not going to be possible. So the four very realistic alternatives that we have is that you can think about dying at home or the residential aged care in a hospice, in the sense that Australia does not have a huge culture around hospices. It may be more an American thing or in the hospital. And that's how this site took shape. And then based on these first two sites, like I went back to my literature and then so all the cancer care booklets and that vocabulary which the doctors use and that is there in the cancer council booklets is it really maps exactly onto each other. So a bit of the bioscope became very cancer centric and then we had to rework it again to make it death centric.
And so tell me, it obviously, like for someone who's done a SaaS platform, so, an online cloud platform and has gone through 2 years of developing that. I know that there's many iterations, many conversations, many feedback. It sounds like the processes has been exactly the same with the Bioscope. So what sort of version of iteration are you at now? And what are your future hopes for the Bioscope to be used?
It's a tough question. Like how you put critical info together so quickly is very impressive, Catherine. And like after coming out of the hospital, making the bioscope and having like that first thing was pretty conclusive for me in many ways. And then I imagined that different hospitals would commission it. So like making a bioscope in Japan would be fascinating, like two languages or visuals and that idea of harakiri or the tension between modernity and tradition. So, or if I were to go back and make one with the pan care guys in India, can support guys in India. And so it can have many versions. And if I made one for Peter Mac, it would be more cancer centric. It would have different colors. It may not just colors, it may have less type, it may have more visuals, it may be in ceramic tiles and all that sort of a thing. But unfortunately, that has not yet happened, but maybe it will happen. But right now, this is my bioscope. So when someone says bring it, I take it. So right now, Karen Brady has it because we are doing like dying to know day thing like you did at that library. We are doing it at in Melton with Harkness later this month, and so that is where it comes out. But I'm working on a set of cards. I don't even like to say I'm working on it because I've been doing it for such a long time now that it's not kind of. But I think there will be versions to it as cards, as maybe a digital thing, maybe just another because I enjoy the making of it. So if someone says, Chetan, can you make me one? I will, but I think it's also because I haven't transitioned out of my PhD well. Like I work like a mercenary now, teach one course here, teach one course there. But if I am in India or Australia, I don't know where I am if I have an academic position, some funding, some PhD, some association, some sort of maybe an NGO who wants it, then I can apply myself back to that again and then co-design it with them again in a different language, take it, use it with the people, embroider it in a different format. So
And tell me, it's obviously your work and the way the bioscope is used as a tool to have conversations has been recognized by the Premier's Design Awards and it's been featured in the Design Outlook conference. What did you find when you were working with those particular groups? what were the things that sort of came up when they were working and looking at the biosphere? How did you find that it was assisting people as a tool to have those conversations?
Like the Premier's Award is more sort of an application, and you put in the images and the text, and they read it, and they say, well, maybe this is and there is Leah High, she's there on, and she has tactile toolkit, so there's a precedent of having worked in this space. And I'm not a very award sort of a person. I just sort of put it in there because students can put it in free, and became a finalist. But then when I was sitting there, I was embarrassed because younger people should have the opportunity to win an award, which they did. So maybe I should have paid some money and put it in the service design category or something. So
Don't ever beat yourself up or sell yourself short. Like
yeah,
we always are too quick to do that. So, it's an amazing achievement to actually be recognized in an award, regardless of whatever category it was.
yeah.
Obviously, when you put your application forward, there was some, it was recognized by your peers. So tell me about, when people interacted, what did you find that they were getting out of the experience with using the bioscope?
So that response is kind of slightly different. So with Premier's Award, there wasn't that kind of exchange. At the Design Outlook conference, there was feedback because there were a lot of designers, and then they said that, well, they would reach out and we would talk about it. So there was a bit of networking, and the design outlook is like a very glamorous industry sort of a thing. So this sort of a work would be unusual in that setting. So I think most of the responses were related to that. But I think where people really respond to the bioscope is when I take it to my local library, which I have been doing, and I did like 3 sessions there. And the first time someone was sitting and looking at it and she started crying, and we were talking about it. And then when I went back, I thought that, well, what kind of a thing is this that it kind of makes people cry? But then I think over time, next time I walked by, she smiled and waved because they have the women's knitting group there. And I think she needed the cry, and she needed to talk about that. And I think that is what happens, and people talk about what they need to talk about. Like some people talk about grandchild leukemia, and then about that child being in the house even after passing away, and then like other worldly experiences, and other people might talk about how they didn't get along with their mum, and that sort of a trauma. If a friend of mine came home and she's a textile artist and she exhibits in Ballarat, and so she came home and then showed her the bioscope was on the wall, and she didn't say anything, and I said she's a textile artist, she'll respond to the textile. And for a while she didn't say anything, and then she suddenly talked about how she lost her mom 6 months back. And then when I was making it, 2 ladies with a baby came up, and they were interested in the embroidery, and they asked me what it is, and I told them like how I turned it like a cushion cover and everything. And then they said that she lost her husband and one child, and you know, so they didn't probably didn't come to see it because of the embroidery at all, is what I feel. So it draws in people in different ways. Sometimes people are dismissive of it also. So all sorts of stuff happens there.
It's very powerful that someone can see, and you could call it a bioscope, but I view it as a beautiful piece of artwork. Like it really is. And for that to be able to evoke emotion and, prompt conversation and open conversations about, really deep things really quickly. that is a rare thing in this space because that's, as you said, our culture in Australia is almost death adverse and it is a taboo subject, as you mentioned. So it is a very powerful tool that is something that it can do.
Thank you. Yeah.
And so, what does it mean for you, given the fact that this is such a culmination of you really in an artwork? It has the heritage of your mother, so much of yourself, and then you also have your son. So, is this a legacy piece for you? How do you view it?
It's very interesting that you asked that because it connects back in ways. So when I did my 3 workshops at the local community center, then Liz, who's the manager of the Thomastown neighborhood house, said, "Chetan, you do more throughout the year." But I didn't want to do like one every month or every 2 weeks with the same people, or I wanted to make a new sort of a thing. So then my wife is also doing her PhD in diabetes and obesity, self-management of that, and it broadened out that it's not just like you can't look at illness in silos. So it's more about well-being and care of the self. And like then we said, maybe it's about life and death. So she's now done 5 workshops with those people to talk about care of the self. So they talk about food one day, about exercise one day, and like mom makes a lot of things with hands. So like for me, doing this in the PhD was a very transformative experience, which means like confronting a lot of stuff for myself. And like I realized that it is closely tied to mental health in some ways. And I think I'd like to make one for to talk about other issues, psychological ones if possible. And in the design space, Catherine has become like a methodology in some ways. So, like my honor students can do projects in depth, and I can support them through that. And someone just worked with Carly at Green Haven, and she's designing something to take a miscarried baby home from the hospital, which is otherwise sent in a blue Ziploc bag. So, like being able to support that student in that journey, but also it now allows me to work with people with disabilities. So in Monash, we built a project with Tikkumala makers and Medistays where we design for short-term accommodation. So that kind of transfers into service design for health. And this semester we are doing design for death and dying. And so many other projects in the design for death and dying space are emerging, but they're also transferable spaces. And like out of all the things, it was this World Futures Review journal. I published an article, and at the Design Outlook conference, I was like, as a witty thing, I was saying that this is a user journey from birth to death. And that sort of has become my model for design, that like I would like to design for the two main life events, birth and death, for a practice of care between birth and death. And that doesn't mean designing for healthcare only, but it also means designing with care, because that can become important in some contexts. And then for the person's relationship to society and to ecology. So I think death has also informed my design space a lot.
Chetan, I think RMIT are very lucky to have you leading their students along the way. To hear the example that you just provided about one of your honours students working with, in practical application of actually supporting a funeral home to support then a family to have something to take their baby home with, that is pretty phenomenal.
That's all. Her name is Ellen Wong, and that's a very promising project. And I think some ways that Victorian Premier Awards also helps me help. Like, I hope she'll submit one and win one. And, at Monash also, there was a very beautiful project which Zarmina, Ayula, and Sarah did, and Zarmina's brother is differently able. So she was very motivated to work on it. And Tom has published it, Mary Stays has published it online, but she's also submitted it for the Good Design Award. So, and Catherine, it's so amazing that, like in Monash, when you put out, like, it's an elective, so students from all disciplines, and so many of them really want to work in this space, and they really come up with like so many different ways of looking at it, which is very, very nice and exciting to not be limited by our own imagination.
And tell me, Chayton, when you have been working on these projects and you've spanned numerous countries and then different audiences with who you've worked with developing the bioscope and now the work that you do with, you know, lecturing and mentoring, tell me, is the work that you do and the focus about death, is it more about life? Because it was interesting, a thing that you mentioned at the very start when we started talking about that when you were working out which area to try and focus on, you were looking at after death rituals to start off with and thinking about that. And then you said something along the lines of death, well, death is just death. And I thought that is exactly it, is that death is death because there's not much you can do about it. That's a kind of like a void, but it's everything you do beforehand or everything that you do after that particular point that is the deciding factor in how people respond to that death. Would you agree with that?
I think that I would, Catherine, absolutely. And like, we don't always have the vocabulary to talk about it, but that many people have said it, and that artist in London also put that artwork during the pandemic, and to say that you cannot stare at death or at the sun for too long. And I think that death is more powerful than the sun. And it's a very deep truth. And I also think that it informs authentic living, and it should inform authentic living. And what that also means is that in the past, when we looked at the existential condition, and philosophers have mostly spoken about death, but it's also about existence, and that the two are tied so closely. And religion gave us narratives towards morality and authentic living and what is right and wrong. But then, with kind of the colonization of death by science, by modern medicine, I think that the rational way of thinking does not always it doesn't have the tools to look at ethics or morality or relationship to ecology like the indigenous people have, that kind of, that relationship with land. And so I think death can become very central in that sort of a way, because even with design, we design for people or not design for people, but I think that designing for people and being conscious that of the temporal nature of life and its relationship to the ecology within which we are inserted becomes very, very important. So, no, not entirely rational, not religious or cultural in that sort of a way, but as a deep truth, it can really help us, like, show us things and as a point of reference, just like the sun. So, yeah, it's not a play on that metaphor really, but I think there is something to that.
Chayton, I can't thank you enough for spending time with us today and just developing or creating, I should say, such a beautiful, roadmap and in the bioscope to really help us navigate the really challenging conversations that are around death and end of life planning. And it is just a beautiful artwork and a beautiful tool. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on your podcast.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.